People sometimes ask me why I moved to Thailand. They usually expect a simple answer. Maybe they think I'll tell them it was because the weather is warm, or because my retirement stretched further, or because Bangkok is exciting. Those things are all true, but none of them are the real reason. The real reason is one I didn't even understand myself until several years after I arrived. I thought I was booking a vacation. What I was really doing was quietly saying goodbye to the life I'd spent more than 70 years building. And the strange part is, I didn't know I was doing it. My name is Margaret. I'm 72 years old. I grew up outside Spokane, Washington, spent most of my adult life exactly where I thought I was supposed to. I married young, raised 2 wonderful children, worked at the county library for nearly 25 years. Nothing glamorous, shelving books, helping people find what they were looking for, watching little children grow into adults who eventually brought their own children through those same doors. It was a good life, a very ordinary life. Looking back, I think ordinary is something people don't appreciate until it's gone. My husband David passed away 8 years before I ever set foot in Thailand. Cancer, the kind that starts with hope, then slowly turns into appointments, hospital rooms, and eventually silence. When you've been married for over 40 years, silence has a sound. For months after the funeral, I'd still wake up in the middle of the night expecting to hear him breathing beside me. Instead, there was only the ceiling fan, the refrigerator humming somewhere down the hallway, and a house that suddenly felt much bigger than it really was. My children were wonderful. They called, they visited when they could. My daughter lived in Colorado. My son had moved to Arizona for work. Both had families of their own, busy lives, exactly the lives I'd spent decades hoping they'd build. I was proud of them. I still am. But pride and loneliness can live in the same house. At first, I stayed busy. Everyone tells you to stay busy. Join clubs, volunteer, take classes, find hobbies. So I tried. I joined a gardening group, started quilting again, even signed up for a watercolor class. The people were kind. The instructors were wonderful. Still, every afternoon I'd come home, unlock the front door, and step into a quiet house that never seemed to notice I'd returned. That's when I realized something nobody prepares you for. Loneliness isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's simply having nobody to tell about your day. You see something funny at the grocery store, and there's no one waiting to hear the story. You cook your favorite dinner, and halfway through the meal, you realize you've barely spoken all day. Days started blending together. Mondays looked like Thursdays. Winters felt longer every year. Even summer somehow seemed quieter than I remembered. I wasn't unhappy. Not exactly. I was existing. One afternoon, my daughter called. She told me something that completely changed the direction of my life. Not on purpose, she was simply talking. Mentioning a coworker whose mother had taken a trip to Thailand after retiring. "Can you believe it?" she laughed. 70 years old, traveling halfway across the world by herself. I laughed too, mostly because the idea sounded ridiculous. Me? Flying to Thailand? I had never even been to New York City. The farthest I'd ever traveled alone was Oregon. Thailand sounded like another planet. Different language, different food, different alphabet, different everything. Still, that conversation stayed with me. For days, then weeks. Eventually, I caught myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I started looking at photographs. Golden temples, tiny cafes hidden down quiet streets, People smiling at strangers. Long-tail boats moving through canals. Older travelers sitting comfortably with coffee, watching the world drift by. It didn't look intimidating. It looked peaceful. I told myself I was only curious, just looking, nothing more. Then one Tuesday morning, without telling anyone, I walked into a travel agency. And before I had enough time to talk myself out of it, I booked a round-trip ticket to Bangkok. 3 weeks. That's all it was supposed to be. 3 weeks. If someone had told me while I stood there holding that itinerary that I would never truly move back to America, I would have smiled politely and told them they were out of their mind. I wish I could tell you that the moment I stepped off the airplane, I knew I'd found the place where I was supposed to be. That would make for a wonderful story. It just wouldn't be true. My first impression of Bangkok was confusion. The airport felt enormous. People seemed to be moving in every direction at once. Signs were written in a language I'd never seen before. Even the air felt different, warm, heavy, carrying the smell of street food, flowers, and traffic, all at the same time. I remember standing outside Suvarnabhumi Airport holding my suitcase, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. The taxi driver smiled, loaded my luggage, and said something in Thai I couldn't understand. All I could do was smile back. For the next 45 minutes, I watched the city unfold outside the window. Towering buildings, tiny food stalls tucked beneath elevated train tracks. Golden temple roofs appearing between modern office buildings. Motorcycles weaving through traffic with a confidence that terrified me. Nothing looked familiar. Yet somehow, nothing felt threatening either. It simply felt alive. I'd booked a modest hotel near the Chao Phraya River. Nothing luxurious, just a clean little room with a small balcony overlooking a side street. Every morning around 6, I'd hear someone pushing a cart full of fresh fruit. By 7, the tiny coffee shop downstairs would already be filled with office workers grabbing breakfast. The owner couldn't speak much English. I couldn't speak any Thai. Yet every morning she'd smile, point toward the coffee pot, and eventually she stopped asking altogether. She already knew. 1 black coffee, no sugar. It amazed me how quickly complete strangers could begin recognizing you. Back home, I could shop at the same grocery store for years and still feel anonymous. Here, the woman making my morning coffee remembered my order before she remembered my name. During those first few days, I walked everywhere, slowly, without much of a plan. Sometimes I'd spend an hour wandering through little neighborhoods where children played outside tiny family businesses. Other afternoons, I'd sit in Lumpini Park, watching elderly couples exercise together while groups of friends laughed over picnic lunches beneath the trees. Nobody seemed to be in a hurry. At least, not the kind of hurry I'd spent my whole life living. I found myself slowing down without even realizing it. One afternoon, I stopped at a small family restaurant because I recognized exactly one thing on the menu: fried rice. Simple enough. The owner noticed I was struggling with the menu and gently suggested another dish instead. I trusted her. It turned out to be one of the best meals I'd eaten in years. After that, every few days I'd return, and she'd choose something different for me. Little by little, my comfort zone became larger than I'd ever imagined. Something else surprised me. People treated me differently. Not because I was American, not because I was a tourist, because I was older. Young people held doors open. Someone always seemed willing to help when I looked lost. More than once, a younger passenger stood up on the BTS SkyTrain and offered me their seat before I even realized they were talking to me. Those little moments stayed with me, not because I expected them, but because somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be noticed in a kind way. Growing older back home sometimes felt like slowly disappearing. Here, I felt visible again. Not famous, not special, simply seen. The 3 weeks I had planned suddenly didn't feel nearly long enough. There were neighborhoods I hadn't explored, museums I hadn't visited, markets people kept recommending. Every evening I'd return to my room thinking, I'll come back someday. Then one night, while looking at my return flight confirmation, a thought quietly slipped into my mind. What if I stayed just a little longer? Not forever, just another month, maybe 6 weeks. After all, I was retired. Nobody was waiting for me back home on Monday morning. There wasn't a job to return to, no appointments I couldn't move, no one depending on me to unlock the front door every evening. For the first time in decades, my schedule belonged entirely to me. So I opened my laptop, logged into the airline's website, and changed my return flight. Just once. 1 extra month. That little decision turned out to be the first domino. I simply didn't know it yet. When I called my daughter to tell her I'd extended my trip, she laughed. "Mom," she said, "I knew you weren't ready to come home." I laughed too, mostly because I thought she was wrong. I still believed I was coming home, just a little later than planned. 1 month became 2, then 3. Somewhere along the way, I stopped waking up feeling like a tourist. I started waking up feeling comfortable. The little coffee shop downstairs no longer asked if I wanted coffee. They simply started making it when they saw me walk in. The young man who sold fresh mangoes near the corner would wave every morning. The security guard outside the hotel greeted me before I greeted him. Little things. Tiny things. The sort of moments most people never think twice about. Yet after years of feeling like just another face in a crowd, they meant more than I can explain. I eventually moved from the hotel into a small furnished apartment. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, a little kitchenette, a washing machine on the tiny balcony. The building was older, paint peeling in places. The elevator occasionally decided it needed a day off. But every evening, I'd open the balcony doors, listen to the sounds of Bangkok drifting through the neighborhood, and think, I'm exactly where I want to be tonight. That feeling surprised me. I'd spent decades believing happiness came from big milestones, buying the house, getting promoted, paying off the mortgage, retirement. Instead, it arrived through ordinary mornings, walking to the market with a reusable shopping bag, learning which bakery made the freshest bread, finding a quiet bench beside the river where I'd sit and watch boats pass without looking at my watch even once. Life had somehow become smaller, and because it became smaller, it also became richer. One Saturday morning, I wandered into a neighborhood market I'd never visited before. Not one designed for tourists, a real local market. Vegetables stacked in neat rows, fresh herbs I'd never seen before. Women laughing behind food stalls while preparing breakfast for regular customers. I stood there completely overwhelmed, not because it was chaotic, because it was beautiful. One older woman noticed me looking completely lost. She smiled, walked over, and pointed toward a bowl of fresh pineapple. I bought 1 container. She handed me another, shook her head, and refused to let me pay for it. I tried insisting. She simply laughed, patted my arm, and wished me a good day. I never learned her name, yet somehow I never forgot her kindness. Back home, I'd become very good at living independently. I fixed things myself, carried my own groceries, never wanted to inconvenience anyone. I wore that independence almost like armor. Bangkok slowly taught me something different. Sometimes, Letting people be kind to you is its own kind of kindness. It allows them to give something. That wasn't an easy lesson for me. Americans often believe accepting help means weakness. Here, it simply felt human. Around that same time, I joined a small language class for foreigners. There were people from Germany, Australia, Canada, Japan, even another retired woman from Texas who would come for what she insisted would only be 2 weeks. We all laughed, because by then we knew exactly what that usually meant. Nobody planned to stay, yet somehow many of us did. Not because we'd been searching for Thailand, because we'd been searching for something we couldn't quite name. Peace, purpose, belonging, a slower life. Everyone's answer was slightly different, but every story sounded strangely familiar. One evening after class, I walked home instead of taking the train. The streets were beginning to cool after another hot day. Families sat outside little restaurants eating dinner together. Children chased each other along the sidewalks. Motorbikes buzzed past every few seconds. I remember stopping on a pedestrian bridge overlooking the traffic below. Thousands of people, all living completely different lives. I stood there longer than I expected. Then a thought appeared, quietly, almost like it had been waiting for the right moment. If I went back to America tomorrow, what exactly would I be going back to? It wasn't a frightening question. Not yet. It was simply the first time I'd ever asked it. And once that question entered my mind, it never really left. The funny thing about staying somewhere longer than you planned is that life back home doesn't pause while you're away. It keeps moving. Birthdays come and go. Neighbors move, restaurants close, children grow older, new grandchildren are born, friends retire, some get sick, others quietly disappear from your Christmas card list. At first, I stayed connected. I called every Sunday. My daughter would tell me about work. My son would update me on whatever project he was tackling around the house. Sometimes we'd laugh for nearly an hour. Other weeks, the conversations lasted 10 minutes, not because anyone loved each other less, simply because life has a way of filling every empty space. Their children had soccer games, school concerts, weekend camping trips, birthday parties, real life, exactly the kind of life I'd spent decades helping them build. One afternoon, my daughter apologized because she'd forgotten to call the weekend before. She felt terrible. I told her not to worry, and I meant it. She was living her life. That's what parents hope for. We don't raise children so they spend every weekend checking on us. We raise them so they can stand on their own. Still, after we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. Not because I was hurt, because something finally became clear. They weren't leaning on me anymore. They didn't need to. I'd done my job. That realization filled me with pride and left a small ache I hadn't expected. Both emotions can exist at the same time. Around my second year in Bangkok, I decided to spend an afternoon looking through old photographs on my laptop. Family vacations, Christmas mornings, camping trips, school graduations, David grilling hamburgers in the backyard while pretending he hadn't burned them. There were thousands of photographs, entire decades of life captured in little rectangles. I smiled through most of them. Then I noticed something. The newest photographs looked different, not because anyone looked older, because I wasn't in them. Birthday dinners, family reunions, Thanksgiving, little league games, school plays. The family kept growing. The story kept moving forward. I was still part of it, just no longer standing in the middle of every picture. For a few minutes, that hurt more than I expected. Then another thought quietly followed. Maybe that's exactly how life is supposed to work. Parents spend decades standing at the center of the family. Then, without anyone announcing it, the next generation takes your place. It's not rejection, it's simply time. I started noticing something similar in my old neighborhood. Neighbors I'd known for years had sold their homes. The young couple across the street had moved to another state. The grocery store where David and I always shopped had closed. Even my favorite little diner had become a pharmacy. Every time I looked back, another familiar piece had changed. The place I remembered still existed inside my memories. Outside those memories, it was slowly becoming somewhere else. Meanwhile, my life in Bangkok kept quietly growing roots. The woman at the bakery started setting aside my favorite bread before I arrived. The pharmacist remembered which allergy medicine worked best for me. The security guard noticed if I hadn't been out walking for a day or two. One rainy afternoon, my neighbor knocked on my apartment door. She'd made too much soup. At least, that's what she claimed. I thanked her. We ended up sitting together for nearly an hour, talking through a translation app, laughing at words neither of us could pronounce correctly. When she finally left, I looked around my apartment. It suddenly didn't feel temporary anymore. It felt lived in, comfortable, home. That night, I found myself asking the question again. If I packed my suitcase tomorrow, what exactly would I be returning to? This time, the answer didn't come as quickly, because for the first time, I realized something that made me surprisingly uncomfortable. I wasn't comparing two places anymore. I was comparing two lives. One was the life I remembered. The other was the life I was living. And memories have a way of becoming more beautiful than reality. I still loved America. I always will. But I had started wondering if the America I missed still existed anywhere except inside my own mind. That question stayed with me for weeks. Eventually, I decided to stop wondering. I opened my laptop, made a pot of coffee, and started looking at what it would actually cost to move home. Not to visit, to move. What I discovered that afternoon changed the way I looked at my future forever. I didn't sit down that afternoon expecting to change my life. Honestly, I thought the numbers would reassure me. I'd tell myself everything was fine, that if I ever wanted to move back, I could. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but someday. Having that option mattered to me, or at least I thought it did. The rain had started outside, one of those steady tropical rains that seems determined to wash the whole city clean. I made another cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and started searching. Apartments, small towns, nothing fancy. I wasn't dreaming about downtown Seattle or beachfront California. I looked at ordinary places, the kind of towns where ordinary people spend ordinary lives, places that reminded me of home. At first, I thought I must have clicked on the wrong listings. The rents couldn't possibly be right. One-bedroom apartments, $1,500, $1,600. Some were nearly $1,800. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. I hadn't rented in years. I'd owned my home before David passed away. After selling it, I never imagined I'd be pricing apartments again in my 70s, especially not at those prices. I grabbed a notebook, not because I enjoy budgeting, because seeing numbers on paper somehow makes them easier to understand. My retirement income wasn't bad. It wasn't enormous either. Like millions of retirees, I depended mostly on Social Security and a little savings I'd worked decades to build. Enough to live comfortably, at least comfortably where I was. I wrote down the monthly income, then the rent. Before I added groceries, utilities, or anything else, well over half my income had already disappeared. That surprised me, more than I wanted to admit. Then I remembered something else. I'd need a car. Bangkok had spoiled me. If I wanted to visit a friend, I'd take the train. If I wanted groceries, I'd walk. If I wanted to explore somewhere new, public transportation was almost always an option. Back home, life didn't work that way. A grocery store might be 15 minutes away by car. The doctor's office, 20. The pharmacy, another direction entirely. Without a vehicle, every simple errand became complicated. So I started adding more numbers. Car insurance, fuel, maintenance, registration, oil changes. Eventually, I stopped writing for a minute. Not because the calculator was wrong, because it wasn't. Then another thought arrived, one I hadn't considered before. Even if I could afford the monthly expenses, where exactly would I live while trying to find an apartment? Hotels? Extended stay motels? Would landlords even rent to someone my age, living almost entirely on retirement income? Questions kept appearing faster than I could answer them. The life I'd left behind wasn't simply waiting for me. It had moved on. And if I wanted to return, I'd have to build another life from the beginning, at 72. That wasn't the part that frightened me most. Starting over never really scared me. I'd already done that once. The part that stayed with me was realizing I'd have to rebuild everything I'd quietly taken for granted. A doctor, a dentist, a pharmacy, neighbors, favorite restaurants, walking routes, the cashier who smiles because she recognizes you, the barber, or in my case, the sweet woman who somehow always remembered exactly how I liked my haircut. People don't think about those things. They think moving is about boxes, furniture, addresses. It's not. Moving is really about relationships, tiny relationships, the kind that take years to build and only one moving truck to erase. I closed my notebook, walked onto my little balcony. The rain had finally stopped. Children were laughing somewhere down the street. A food cart was opening for the evening. Someone nearby was practicing guitar. It wasn't perfect. Cities never are. Still, I stood there thinking about something that had never crossed my mind before. Maybe the question wasn't, can I afford to move back? Maybe the better question was, why would I leave a life that already feels like home? That thought unsettled me, because once I admitted it, I knew there was another question waiting right behind it. One I'd been avoiding ever since I extended that first plane ticket. If home wasn't America anymore, then where did I actually belong? Something changed during my 3rd year in Bangkok. Not all at once. There wasn't one defining moment, no grand realization. It happened quietly, the way most important things do. One afternoon, I was walking home from the market carrying 2 small bags of groceries. Nothing unusual. A little fruit, fresh vegetables, some chicken for dinner. As I reached my apartment building, the young security guard looked up from his chair and smiled. "Miss Margaret," he said, "you weren't here yesterday. Everything okay?" I smiled back, told him I'd taken the train across town to visit a museum. He laughed, said he'd wondered where I'd disappeared to. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds. That was all. Yet after I went upstairs, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Someone had noticed I was gone. Not because they were responsible for me, not because they had to, simply because I was part of their everyday life. I'd forgotten what that felt like. The longer I stayed, the more those little moments added up. The woman who owned the laundry shop knew I preferred my shirts folded instead of hung. The fruit vendor would quietly set aside the sweetest mangoes when they were in season because she knew they were my favorite. One of the waiters at a small cafe near the river stopped handing me menus altogether. The moment I walked through the door, he'd smile and say, "Coffee first?" He was always right. It wasn't extraordinary, it was familiarity. And familiarity is one of the quietest forms of belonging. One evening, I was invited to celebrate Loy Krathong with a few neighbors. I'd heard about the festival, seen photographs, thousands of tiny floating baskets carrying candles across the water. Beautiful, peaceful. I'd never imagined I'd be part of it. One of the older women in my building knocked on my door carrying extra flowers and banana leaves. She spoke almost no English. I spoke even less Thai. Still, between smiles, hand gestures, and a translation app, we somehow spent nearly an hour making my first krathong together. Mine looked terrible. Hers looked like it belonged in an art gallery. She laughed so hard she had tears in her eyes. Eventually, we carried our little floating baskets to the river with everyone else. Families, grandparents, young couples, children running ahead. The city felt completely different that night. Quieter somehow. Softer. As I placed my little krathong into the water, I found myself looking around. Not as a tourist, not even as a visitor. I was simply another person sharing the evening. It may sound like a small thing. To me, it meant everything. Back home, I'd spent years trying not to bother anyone. If something broke, I fixed it myself. If I felt lonely, I kept it to myself. If I needed help, I'd usually convince myself I didn't. Here, people included one another almost automatically. Neighbors shared meals. Families checked on elderly relatives every day. Shop owners remembered birthdays. People stopped to talk, not because they were trying to be polite, because relationships seemed woven into everyday life. I'd almost forgotten that life could feel that way. One rainy afternoon, the electricity went out for a couple of hours in my neighborhood. Instead of everyone disappearing behind closed doors, people wandered downstairs. Someone brought a deck of cards. Another neighbor made tea. Children sat on the floor playing games while the adults talked. Nobody seemed particularly bothered by the inconvenience. Looking around, I realized something. If the power had gone out back in my old neighborhood, I probably wouldn't have known a single person sitting in the dark around me. Here, I knew nearly everyone. Not deeply, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to laugh together while waiting for the lights to come back on. That evening, after everyone returned to their apartments, I sat on my balcony listening to the sounds of Bangkok settling into another night. The city wasn't quiet. It never really is. Somewhere a train rolled past. Motorcycles buzzed through the streets. A dog barked. Someone downstairs laughed so loudly it echoed between the buildings. For the first time in years, those sounds didn't feel unfamiliar. They sounded comforting. And that's when another realization quietly settled over me. I hadn't just built a routine here. I'd built a community. Without ever planning to. Without ever noticing exactly when it happened. The city that had once felt so foreign had slowly become familiar. and somewhere along the way, I had become familiar to it. The numbers I had written in my notebook still mattered. Of course they did. Retirement has to make financial sense. But standing there on that little balcony, I finally understood something. Money wasn't the biggest reason I wasn't sure I could go back. The biggest reason was that I'd finally found something I'd been missing for years. A place where I wasn't simply growing older. I was still part of life. A few weeks after I'd filled page after page with numbers, I stopped looking at apartment listings. Not because I'd solved the problem, because I realized I was asking the wrong question. Every calculation led me back to the same place: rent, insurance, groceries, utilities, medical costs. Yes, they all mattered. Retirement has a way of making every dollar feel important. But whenever I closed the laptop, my mind wandered somewhere else. Not to spreadsheets, to people. That's when I decided to try a different exercise. Instead of making a budget, I made 2 lists. On one side of the page, I wrote everything I'd be returning to if I moved back to America. On the other, I wrote everything I'd be leaving behind in Bangkok. I expected both lists to be about the same length. They weren't, not even close. The first list started easily enough. My daughter, my son, my grandchildren. A few cousins I still exchanged Christmas cards with. Then I stopped writing. Not because I couldn't think of anyone else, because I realized how much had changed. The couple who lived beside us for nearly 20 years had moved away. My favorite little bookstore had closed. The church David and I attended had merged with another congregation. Even if I returned, I wouldn't be returning to the life I remembered. I'd be returning to a place that had continued living without me, just as it should have. Life doesn't freeze because someone leaves. Then I looked at the second page, the one titled Bangkok. I expected a few names, maybe 3 or 4. Instead, I kept writing. The woman who owned the coffee shop, the security guard downstairs, my neighbor from across the hall, the waitress who always laughed when I tried speaking Thai, the little bakery, the language class, the park where I walked every Tuesday morning, the flower vendor who insisted I should take 1 extra orchid because flowers make people happier, the pharmacist who remembered my allergies before I did, the elderly gentleman I often played chess with in Lumpini Park. I never even learned his last name. Yet somehow, he'd become part of my weekly routine. Page 2 kept growing. Without me realizing it, I built another life. Not a vacation, not an adventure, a life. One Sunday afternoon, I video called my daughter. The grandchildren were running around the house behind her. Someone had left crayons on the kitchen table. The television was on in another room. It was wonderfully chaotic, exactly the way family homes should be. At one point, my youngest grandson ran over to the camera. "Grandma," he shouted, "when are you coming back?" Children ask questions with complete honesty. No filters, no hidden meaning. I smiled, told him, "I'll come visit soon." His face lit up. Then, just as quickly, he ran back to whatever game he'd been playing. That moment stayed with me, not because it made me sad, because it reminded me of something important. He didn't need me to move back. He simply wanted to see me. Those are 2 very different things. I could still be his grandmother. I could still love my family completely, without living 15 minutes away. Love doesn't always measure distance the same way people do. That evening, I walked down to the river just before sunset. The sky was turning shades of orange and gold. Boats drifted quietly through the water. People hurried home from work. Street vendors were setting up for the evening crowd. I found an empty bench, sat down, and asked myself one final question. If money weren't part of the equation, if someone handed me a free apartment, a reliable car, perfect health, would I actually want to move back? I waited, almost expecting my heart to argue with me. Instead, the answer arrived almost immediately. No. Not because I loved America any less, because somewhere between the coffee shop, the language classes, the neighborhood market, and all the ordinary days in between, Bangkok had quietly become my everyday life. You don't walk away from a life simply because another one came first. That's when I finally understood what had been bothering me for months. The money had never been the real obstacle. The real obstacle was trying to go backward. Life doesn't move backward. It only moves forward. Sometimes forward takes you somewhere you never expected. People sometimes ask me if I miss America. I always smile, because they're expecting either yes or no. The truth isn't nearly that simple. Of course I miss it. I miss autumn, the smell of fallen leaves after the first cold rain, small-town diners where everyone orders the same breakfast they've been eating for 20 years. I miss Thanksgiving, Christmas lights hanging from houses covered in fresh snow. I even miss things that used to annoy me, the sound of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, watching baseball on a summer afternoon, standing in line at the grocery store while two neighbors catch up on everyone's business. Those memories are part of me. They always will be. You don't spend more than 70 years loving a country and suddenly stop. America raised me. It shaped me. It gave me a wonderful husband, 2 incredible children, a career I was proud of, a lifetime of memories. Nothing can ever take that away. Thailand didn't replace those memories. It simply gave me new ones. That's an important difference. Sometimes people talk about moving overseas as though it's choosing one country over another. That has never been how it felt to me. I didn't stop loving where I came from. I simply found another place where life still had room for me. Somewhere, I started smiling again without forcing it. Somewhere, my mornings became something I looked forward to. Somewhere, I stopped counting the years behind me and started enjoying the days in front of me. Last month, I walked to the neighborhood market just after sunrise. The flower vendors were setting up. Someone was grilling breakfast on the corner. Scooters buzzed past like they always do. The young woman at the bakery handed me my usual bread before I even asked. As I started walking home, I realized something. This wasn't exciting anymore. It was ordinary. And strangely enough, that made me happier than any vacation ever could. Vacations end. Ordinary life is where we actually live. I still visit my family. I still video call my grandchildren. Every birthday, every holiday, every school achievement they proudly hold up to the camera. Those moments matter, more than I can ever put into words. Being thousands of miles apart doesn't change that. Love has always found ways to travel. Sometimes through letters, sometimes through telephones, now through tiny screens we carry in our pockets. We're still a family, just one that happens to live in different parts of the world. Every once in a while, someone tells me, I could never do what you did. I understand why they say that. Honestly, for most of my life, I would have said exactly the same thing. If you'd told the 50-year-old version of me that one day I'd be living halfway across the world, shopping at neighborhood markets, learning bits of another language, making friends I'd never imagined meeting, I would have laughed. Then I'd have told you how impossible that sounded. Life has a funny way of proving us wrong. Sometimes the chapter you're most afraid to begin becomes the one you're most grateful you lived. If you're watching this because you're thinking about starting over somewhere, whether that's Thailand, another country, or simply another town, I hope you remember one thing. Don't chase someone else's dream. Don't move because a stranger on the internet tells you to. And don't believe changing your address automatically changes your life. It doesn't. The real change happens much more slowly. One conversation, one neighbor, one familiar face, one ordinary morning at a time. That's how a place becomes home. Not all at once, quietly, almost without you noticing. I thought I was taking a 3-week vacation. Instead, I found a second chapter I never knew was waiting for me. Not because Thailand is perfect, no place is, but because for the first time in many years, I felt like life was still inviting me forward instead of reminding me what I'd left behind. Maybe that's what home really is, not the place where your story began, the place where you still can't wait to see what happens tomorrow. If someone asked me today whether I'd make the same decision again, I'd answer without hesitation. Yes, every single time. Because I didn't lose a home, I found another one. And at 72, that turned out to be the greatest surprise of my entire life. Thank you for spending a little time with me today. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're building a life that feels like home. Because in the end, that may be the most valuable thing any of us ever find.